Good afternoon. On behalf of Washington State University Tri-Cities, I'd like to welcome you to today's panel presentation, Challenging Exclusion and Segregation in the Mid-Columbia Region. I respectfully acknowledge that WSU Tri-Cities is located on shared traditional homelands of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation and the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation. We are pleased to host this event in support of the WSU Common Reading Program and its purpose to create a community of learning that connects each of us as we explore and discuss complex issues. Before we get started, there are a few items to note. In today's webinar, questions will be received through the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You're welcome to post questions at any time using this feature. However, questions will be held until the end of the presentations. Please keep in mind that we may not be able to address all questions due to time. The chat feature is reserved for reporting technical issues. For students attending the webinar as part of the Common Reading, please be advised that the link to confirm your participation will be included at the end of the event in the chat section. Introducing our panelist is WSU Tri-Cities Chancellor, Sandra Haynes.
Well, good afternoon. Please join me in welcoming our presenters, for this event. Give them a little round of applause right now. perhaps a virtual round of applause. Dr. Robert Bauman is Professor of History and Academic Director of the College of Arts and Sciences at Washington State University, Tri-Cities. He is an award-winning scholar and author of a number of articles and book chapters and 2 books, Race and the War on Poverty, From Watts to East LA in 2008, and Fighting to Preserve a Nation's Soul, America's Ecumenical War on Poverty in 2019. Dr. Bauman is also co-editor with Robert Franklin and co-author of 2 volumes in the Hanford History series published by WSU Press. Nowhere to Remember, Hanford, White Bluffs, and Richland to 1943, published in 2018, and Echoes of Exclusion and Resistance, Voices from the Hanford Region, published in December 2020. Robert Franklin is the Assistant Director and Archivist of the Hanford History Project, Director of the Hanford Oral History Project, a certified archivist and lecturer in the History Department at WSU Tri-Cities. Robert received his MA in History with a public history focus at Washington State University, in 2014. He is co-editor and co-author of the first volume of the Hanford History series published by WSU Press. Laura Arata is Assistant Professor of History and Director of Public History at Oklahoma State University. She received her PhD from Washington State University. She has authored 2 chapters for volumes in the Hanford History series. Her first book, Race and the Wild West, Sarah Bickford, the Montana Vigilantes and the Tourism of Decline, 1840 to 1930, was released in 2020 from the University of Oklahoma Press. Thank you for participating today in this Common Read event. You are in for a real treat.
Thank you, Chancellor Haynes, very much for that introduction. I want to also thank my History Department colleague, Tracy Hanshu, for inviting us and helping to organize this panel. We're really honored to be part of WSU's Common Read event series and happy to be here today to share some of our research with you. I also want to quickly thank both Edie Balint and Dave Basler. Their behind the scenes work to make this possible wouldn't have happened without their work. So thank you both very much. All right. Our presentations are part of a new volume in a series published by WSU Press about the Hanford region. And so I'm going to say the volume looks like this. And in serendipitous timing, our book literally just came out. It was just published, so it is available to purchase it through WSU Press or Amazon. So we're really excited about that. This volume, making use of a number of oral histories, places front and center the voices of those whose voices have often been erased from history. In addition to some of the topics we'll be sharing with you today, we also, I want to note there's a chapter in our book written by one of our colleagues, Tom Marceau, about the experiences of Native people in the Hanford region. Our presentations today are going to explore the development and changing nature of racial segregation and discrimination in the Tri-Cities and efforts by African Americans and Japanese Americans to challenge that segregation and discrimination. And I will say also that our presentations directly link to the themes of the Common Read book, Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. For the system of segregation that existed in the Tri-Cities did contain some similarities with the system of apartheid in South Africa. It was not nearly as entrenched in law as apartheid, but separation of the races in many aspects of life was a reality in the Tri-Cities for the groups and individuals that we'll be talking about today. In addition, if you've read Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime, he was born a crime as a mixed race child in South Africa. And the individuals and groups we'll be talking about today, at times, essentially were considered crimes as well, simply because of who they were. So my talk to focus on the history and the story of the Yamauchi family, who were longtime residents of the Tri-Cities. So when he was home on furlough from the Army in December of 1943, Sergeant George Yamauchi wrote a letter to the editor of what was then the Pasco Herald, asking a fundamental question of citizenship. What is an American? For he found that the community he lived in and had grown up in had changed. Members of his own family, who were longtime residents and successful business owners who remained in his hometown, now faced persistent discrimination and hostility. And he noted that he was, quote, very much disappointed in the seemingly narrow outlook on life that so many citizens have adopted since the war began. The neighborly attitude of the people had changed to that of distrust and suspicion. And he went on to warn his fellow townspeople against what he called, quote, falling victim to the very thing against which Americans are giving their lives. In other words, fascism. And he asked the readers of the local newspaper, quote, what is an American? Is he white, black, yellow, red, or any other certain color? It is generally conceded that he is any one of these or a mixture of them all. That is one of the principles of our Constitution, is it not? And he also went on to note that his sister had been denied renewal of business license for one of the cafes that his family operated, and she'd been denied because she was of Japanese descent. In addition, at the time he wrote the letter, some members of his family, including his parents, were at that time imprisoned in internment camps at Heart Mountain, Wyoming, and Minidoka, Idaho. Indeed, he had been imprisoned at Minidoka prior to joining the Army. So when he wrote this letter in December of 1943, his family was literally torn apart by the war and the internment camps. So this is a map of Japanese imprisonment during World War II. And so it might surprise some of you, especially some of you who might be from the Tri-Cities or know the Tri-Cities region, that Japanese Americans, some Japanese Americans in our area were sent to internment camps. We're not exactly on the coast. The drive to the beach from the Tri-Cities is a distance, but Japanese Americans in the area, some were sent to internment camps. So essentially during World War II, someone in the War Relocation Authority determined that this would be the boundary. And so people of Japanese descent who lived generally on the Franklin County side of the Columbia River were not sent to internment camps. Those who lived on the Benton County side were sent to internment camps. The exceptions were that the Yamauchi parents were sent to internment camps even though they lived in Franklin County because they were Japanese nationals, had been born in Japan. So some of the Yamauchi family, those who lived in Franklin County were sent to internment camps, and those who lived in Benton County were not. Before we get well into the story of the Yamauchi family, I do want to note that Japanese Americans, the Yamauchis, were not the first Asian American group to move to the Tri-Cities. There was a significant Chinese American population in Pasco in the 1880s as the Northern Pacific Railroad was being built across the Pacific Northwest, and Pasco was a hub for the Northern Pacific. And so so there was a small Chinatown in Pasco, and this is a picture of one of the buildings, Wang Hao Notions. Mr. Wang Hao was a successful businessman at that time. And so there had been, as early as the 1880s, a Chinese American population in Pasco and the Tri-Cities. The Yamauchis, and this is his name was Asechiro, but he went by Harry, and his wife Chica Yamauchi, and their 4 oldest children in this photo, which was taken probably around 1912. And this is in one of the many businesses that they owned. And I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but at the bottom of the photo, some family wrote in rising generation, which is a great way to think about, right, how many immigrant parents, right, thought about their children born in the United States, that they were the rising generation. So the Yamauchis had left Japan in 1904, moved to the Hawaiian Islands, spent a couple years there working on sugar plantations, and then eventually made their way to Pasco in 1907, where Harry Yamauchi got a job working for the Northern Pacific Railroad. After about 5 years of working for the railroad, he had saved enough money to open a few businesses, a cigar and tobacco shop, and a grocery store in downtown Pasco. This photo shows Chica Yamauchi and the oldest 7 of her 9 children, probably around 1920. By the 1920s, Yamauchis owned 6 businesses, and they were by all measures, as you might imagine, a successful American family. And Harry was a very influential businessman in the town of Pasco. Here's another photo, another one of the Yamauchi businesses. This was their M&M Cafe, and you can see Chica Yamauchi and one of the Yamauchi sons there in the cafe. And one of Harry's daughters, Lou Yamauchi, talked about how Harry liked to regularly attend city council meetings, and he would bring gifts to city councilmen, and she had to tell them to stop doing that because that might be seen as bribery. And he didn't speak English very well, so she went essentially as his interpreter to the city council meetings. As Robert and Laura are going to demonstrate in their presentations, African Americans who came to the Hanford area faced segregation, racial discrimination. And although there was no formal legal segregation of Japanese Americans before the war, Japanese Americans and all non-whites in Pasco were segregated by practice to east of the railroad tracks in Pasco. So the small Asian American and African American populations in Pasco before the war lived in the same neighborhood, lived next to each other. This is a photo of Lou Yamauchi and Gladys Sutton, who was her best friend. They grew up next to each other. Lou Yamauchi would be the first Asian American to graduate from Pasco High School, and Gladys Sutton, the first African American to graduate from Pasco High School. And even decades later, the next generation of Yamauchis in the years after the war talked about that they could not leave East Pasco, that they had to live in East Pasco in the years after the war, and that going on the other side of the railroad tracks was strictly forbidden. But despite the residential segregation that existed at the time, as I said, the Yamauchi family was definitely a success story. And then the war came. And as it did for the vast majority of Japanese Americans living in the United States, the events of December 7, 1941, and the subsequent decision in the Executive Order 9066 in 1942, right, imprisoned over 120,000 Japanese Americans on the mainland. And so the Yamauchi family was part of that. As I said, some were sent to internment camps and some were not. One of the Yamauchi, Chioko Yamauchi Minatoya, and her husband Con, and their daughters Arlene and Connie were sent to the internment camp at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. And so here's a photo of Arlene and Connie at the internment camp at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Other members of the Yamauchi family were sent to Minidoka, Idaho. And the story of the Yamauchi's oldest daughter, Lou, and her husband, Henry Sato, is really unique. Henry Sato, her husband, had born in Japan and moved to the United States and was a successful businessman in the Portland area and did a lot of business with Japanese companies. And because of that, he was sent to a high security detention center at Fort Missoula, Montana, when the war began. At some point, he was told that he could be released either to a regular internment camp or go back to Japan. And he was so angry at what had happened to him and his family that he decided to go back in Japan. So he and his wife, Lou, who had been Lou Yamauchi, now Lou Sato, and their young infant son moved to Japan during the war, spent the rest of the war in Japan. During the war, both Henry Sato and their infant son died. Lou Yamauchi Sato had another son shortly before her husband died. And so she and her new son, Masashi, spent the rest of the war in Japan and were not able to return to the United States until 1950, 5 years after the war ended. And when they did return, their son, Masashi, when they came to the United States, he was told he was going to need to choose an American name. Robert Franklin and I were able to interview he and some of his cousins a couple of years ago, and he said that he only knew 2 words in English when he came to the United States as a 6-year-old, and those 2 words were Roy Rogers. And so he chose the name Roy because of Roy Rogers, the actor and some movie star from the period. And this is a photo. So in 2018, Robert Franklin and I were able to interview these 4 Yamauchi cousins, the grandchildren, some of the grandchildren of Harry and Chica Yamauchi, Brenda Yamauchi Cooper, Roy Sato, Linda Yamauchi Atkinson, and Bruce Yamauchi. And I want to go back one screen. According to the Yamauchi children and grandchildren, Harry and Chica Yamauchi really rarely talked about their internment, rarely if ever. And their daughter Mary, and this is Mary, at her 102nd birthday party, said of her grandfather in 2005, he didn't talk too much about the experience, but he was kind of perturbed. He knew in his heart that he didn't do anything that was against the government. So I'd like to return now to George Yamauchi's letter that he wrote in December 1943. I came across this letter that he wrote to the editor of the Pasco Herald over 20 years ago. And at the time, I thought it was a fundamentally significant expression of the Japanese experience. And I still think so, but I also think it's much more significant than that. His niece, Linda Atkinson, he interviewed her, expressed it well, and she said the letter was, quote, a plea to remember who we all were, a plea to remember who the Yamauchi family was and the role in the Pasco community, and a plea to remember what it meant to be American. George Yamauchi challenged and resisted the racial status quo in the Tri-Cities during the war through his letter. At a time when he and other members of his family experienced restrictions on their freedom, along with imprisonment and hatred and bigotry. His poignant plea, what is an American, and his answer to that plea demonstrate one way that his family fought racial prejudice and fought being seen as crimes. And his eloquent words and heartfelt message, I think, remain especially relevant and important in today's America when migrant children are held in prison camps and racial discrimination and violence remain central to the experiences of many non-whites in the Tri-Cities and in the United States. I am going to now turn it over to my colleague, Robert Franklin.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'll be talking about the 2 chapters that I with Bob contributed to the book about African American history within the Hanford and the Tri-Cities region, from the Manhattan Project through the Civil Rights era. And my email is down there, robertfranklin@wcu.edu, if anyone would like to reach out to me after this presentation. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that funding for the work that went into these 2 chapters and the collection up on the Hanford History Project website came from the National Park Service on a 2-year grant that we worked with them to document African-American migration, segregation, and civil rights history at the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, Hanford. And in addition, part of that funding went towards gathering and digitizing and transcribing oral histories from that the African American Community Cultural and Educational Society, based out of Pasco, had conducted in the early 2000s. Many of that group, which is shortened to Access, many of their oral histories had been with actual Manhattan Project era workers, all of whom had sadly passed away by the time our project began in 2017. And that group's early efforts to document this history resulted in gathering material that otherwise would have been lost to history. So I just want to acknowledge those two really crucial partners in bringing this history to the page and to you today. So the Hanford area springs up in the middle of 1943 in what was the towns of Hanford and White Bluffs and Richland. The Hanford Site, the 500 and well, the now 587 square miles of the Hanford Site, which is taken from the former residence. And in total, the DuPont Corporation brings about 120,000 workers to this Hanford area. Of that 120,000, only about 45,000 live at the Hanford construction camp, which is going to be the temporary housing for the workers that are going to build this massive project. Hanford, being one of the 3 sites of the Manhattan Project, was chosen as the site that would basically manufacture plutonium using then the brand new and untested technology of nuclear reactors, as well as chemical processing plants. And these workers, black and white, would build these, and they would also go on to build basically all of the infrastructure that required, and much of the town of Richland itself, as it now stands. Of this workforce, about 10 to 15% were African Americans who came largely, almost entirely from the South, from every southern state except for Tennessee. Tennessee was home to Oak Ridge and was not, DuPont was not allowed to recruit from Oak Ridge because Oak Ridge, being one of the 3 sites of the Manhattan Project, had labor issues that it needed to keep some of its labor home. This ratio, 10 to 15%, had been negotiated between DuPont and the federal government as part of the Fair Employment Practices Commission, a New Deal era commission that basically said that any federal contractor had to hire a certain percentage of African American labor. This was kind of some early civil rights legislation by the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration during the New Deal. And so 10 to 15% was the number that DuPont had agreed upon with the FEPC commission, which would kind of comply with their numbers and would not upset either the arriving white workers or the existing mostly white residents of the Tri-Cities area. In addition, DuPont also met with city leaders from Pasco and Kennewick, who were city and business leaders who were incredibly nervous about this influx of African-American residents. And in fact, they demanded that DuPont furnish all of these people with tickets home after their work was over. DuPont agreed to do this in writing, but never actually furnished these tickets. And this reflected the racial anxieties and race attitudes of these city leaders who were worried that this influx of African Americans would destabilize or would irreparably damage the character, the overwhelmingly white character of the Tri-Cities. The Hanford construction camp itself, as I mentioned, held about 45,000 people, and in a mixture of barracks as well as in the world's largest trailer court. And there was an overflow of people, and those folks, white workers who couldn't find room at the Hanford construction camp, lived in the towns of Kennewick and Pasco. For African Americans, they were relegated to East Pasco. And East Pasco is divided from Pasco by the Pasco rail yard. Literally, African American workers had to live across the tracks. And East Pasco, which during the history that Bob Bauman had talked about, was this area, this railroad area of a few African-American, but also Chinese and Japanese workers, became this overwhelmingly Black area of town, and had many similarities to a ghetto, in that it lacked a lot of essential city services. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. The construction camp and amenities and work at Hanford were segregated by race. And the barracks themselves at the camp were segregated by gender and by race. African-American workers were, men were limited to mostly menial construction jobs, labor, basic laboring. They were not hired on as scientists or engineers in the Manhattan Project. African-American women largely relegated to domestic work, as well, like maids, as well as working in the mess halls. And even the entertainment and activities were segregated by race. This is the schedule of Christmas activities from 1944, from an official DuPont history of the Manhattan Project. And you can see here the very plain segregation that was imposed by DuPont here in the Pacific Northwest, and that kind of followed and was put in place upon arrival of African Americans to the Pacific Northwest. This was not, their moving to the Pacific Northwest was not a movement of emancipation. They found the segregation had followed them when they had arrived here. As I mentioned, their work was largely segregated, although African Americans made really important contributions to building the physical structure of Hanford. The reactors themselves, laying the graphite, pouring the concrete, and provided, during World War II, labor was at such a shortage that that these jobs were essential, and they contributed to the war. Another important factor why African Americans took these jobs is, although the labor was segregated, their living was segregated, heck, even the Christmas activities were segregated, the pay was the same. The Fair Employment Practices Commission mandated that government contractors pay white workers and Black workers equal wages for their work. This meant, in effect, that many African Americans who had been sharecroppers or worked for minuscule wages in the South, $3 a week, $5 a week, were now making on average about $1 an hour at Hanford. And so going, 3 to 6 to 10 times the amount of money they would have made in the South, equivalent to what they were making at Hanford. Really transformative wages, and explaining why this was such an attractive proposition for so many. East Pasco, beginning in 1944 and continuing on through the 1950s, developed into a slum, basically, as basic as we can put it. There was no sewer system. Often, if electricity was available, it was a single outlet. Many residents used wood burning stoves to heat their homes and cook on through the 1950s. There were no streetlights. There were no paved streets. And many homes were in dilapidated trailers, automobile trailers, or in some cases from scavenged materials, literally shanties, drawing a very similar connection to shanty towns, Bantu homesteads in Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime. In addition, Kennewick especially, but the Tri-Cities in general, the West Pasco, Richland, but largely the Kennewick area, developed racial anxiety and anger at new Black arrivals. Signs like "This We Cater to White Trade Only" began to appear in many restaurants and service areas, clearly demonstrating inequality. Kennewick city leaders and the police actually prided themselves that Kennewick was known as a lily white town, and African Americans were barred from living in Kennewick up until the mid-1960s. James Pruitt, who migrated to the area after World War II in 1948, came from Mississippi by way of California, and he had expected something different. And in his interview, he said that he was dismayed to find the same thing that he had left in Mississippi had had, in his mind, followed him to Kennewick, or really had existed here. That this was a situation that African American migrants would face wherever they had moved. Virginia Crippen, who moved to East Pasco shortly after World War II to open up, saw a business opportunity and opened up a place to eat, Virgie's Chicken Shack, largely because many Black residents were not welcome to eat in white establishments. And so this had created, by necessity, opportunity for Black entrepreneurs who could afford to move. As conditions continued to not improve over the 1950s, many African American residents late in the 1950s re-energized the NAACP chapter that had briefly existed during World War II. In addition, had formed other civil rights chapters like the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, and began to march, joining the larger civil rights movement, both North and South, for racial equality. And especially one of these instances we talk about in our book is this 1963 march in Kennewick, headed by the NAACP. In 1963, Jack Tanner, the head of the NAACP in the Pacific Northwest, had called Kennewick the Birmingham of Washington. And one local pastor went further, and he said that Kennewick was actually worse than Birmingham because Blacks could live in Birmingham, whereas they could not live in Kennewick. Sundown laws, which had mandated that African Americans be out of town when the sun went down, had effectively and de facto informal segregation and racial animosity towards Blacks had effectively stopped them from being able to afford or being able to rent or buy housing in Kennewick. Wally Webster, who I interviewed for the project, who was an early leader of the Congress on Racial Equality, was a young man when he got here. He was only 18 when he got here in the early 1960s. And Wally had marched with King in Alabama earlier on in the Civil Rights Crusade. And he came north looking for work. And he, as a young man, he realized that he felt called to action. And I picked out this quote. He said when he got here, he said, what they talked about on TV in Alabama, I could see it in East Pasco. I could see it in Kennewick. I could see it in Richland. Those were all connected in terms of the motivation to do something. And Wally felt he could not kind of sit idly by and realized that this civil rights struggle was not just a Southern struggle, that it had permeated the entire United States. Here's a shot, the cover of our book. This image might be familiar to you at this point. This is part of that 1963 march in downtown Kennewick, and this is roughly on First and Auburn. A later event took place in 1969 in Pasco. This one a bit more violent and ominous, and largely reflecting the fact that despite the marching, little had changed in Pasco. At this point in 1969, Pasco had no Black employees by the city. It had no Black police officers. And East Pasco residents had for over 2 decades felt totally disconnected, ignored, and sometimes even targeted by city government. Reports of Black harassment or police harassment towards a Black teenager had resulted in a mostly white mob converging in front of the Franklin County Courthouse in Pasco and setting fire to cop cars and trees. James Pruitt, then leader of CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, had come out to kind of talk the mob down, and he and Wally Webster were able to get a grant that paid for the first Black policeman in the Pasco police force. And it's telling that they had to find outside funding to hire that first Black policeman. But James Pruitt also, he correctly identified the problem that African Americans at this point made up 15 to 20% of the residents of Pasco, yet they were not represented in any official capacity within the city. Things did improve over the course of the 1960s and 70s. Affirmative action legislation led to Hanford and Hanford contractors employing more African Americans. And urban renewal certainly had transformed the Pasco landscape, helping some residents, leave segregated East Pasco and diverge out into the community. But those efforts, like other affirmative action efforts, Initiative 200 here locally in Washington, had petered out. And I want to end with this quote by Dallas Barnes, who I interviewed. He said, "As of today, Hanford isn't doing anything." He says, "In the Tri-Cities, I don't even think that you can point to a Black community. I don't think that you can say that there is an East Pasco anymore that's predominantly Black. You can't do that. If you're going to say the Black has been absorbed into the community, then you can't say that's the case, because we can't see their physical presence in your classroom or on this campus or distributed through the mainstream or business community that you would expect, having them come through all of that. In terms of what Hanford did, I think Hanford made an effort during this day. But I think Hanford's efforts with Blacks, just like their efforts with the reactors out there, they're decommissioned." And now I'm going to turn it over to Laura Arata, who is going to talk about women's, African-American women's experiences at Hanford and in the Tri-Cities.
Thank you. Thank you for being patient with me. The technology is always, struggle is real as we get started. I want to thank WSU for hosting this event. I was just sitting here thinking that the last time I participated in a common read, I was a grad student at WSU, and we were reading Flu by Gina Kolata, which seems like a little prophetic now. I've been honored to be part of the Hanford History Project, and I'm so honored to have the opportunity to introduce just a few of the Black women who so very generously shared with us their experiences and their stories, and to draw a few connections with Trevor Noah's really important and timely autobiography, Born a Crime. The distance between the Tri-Cities and South Africa seems great at a first glance, but there are a lot of commonalities of experience embedded in these stories that speak to larger truths. As both of my co-panelists have pointed out, crimes of being are far too common, and they persist when they are not questioned. So thank you all for being here to engage in this conversation where we start to question some of these things. Geographically, Washington State and South Africa are separated by oceans, but ideologically, Jim Crow and apartheid share some recognizable similarities. And one of those is the extraordinary pressures that were placed on Black women to sustain and nurture family bonds while they were seeking out opportunities to better their conditions. And this is what Trevor Noah characterizes as trying to bring everyone behind you back up to zero before it's possible to move forward. And the women interviewed for the Hanford History Project spoke to this in some really profound ways. They drew attention to all of these pressures that they faced, and by and large, their overwhelming success in navigating them. Most of them arrived at the Tri-Cities with a lot of hope just for finding better conditions. And most of them at some point felt the really stinging disappointment of being caught between oppression and necessity. And were aware to some degree that they represented part of a larger movement known as the Great Migration that carried millions of Black Americans across the country during and after the Second World War. A lot of them were drawn by kinship bonds. Emma Mitchell Peeples, for example, recalled that she had family out this way and her big brother had come this way and eventually sent for her. And the family gradually rebuilt itself in East Pasco. This influx of arrivals swelled the African-American population of Pasco from about 27 people in 1940 to thousands in the following decade. So you can imagine the pressures that came along with that. And it's really important to note that Washington was an unknown for most of these migrants, but they also recognized that it presented a potential escape from the really vicious, poverty-bound agricultural systems that they were familiar with in the South. But of course, systemic racism also followed along with migrants, and Jim Crow segregation took hold in the Tri-Cities as a result of local and transplanted prejudice. There were Black job seekers, there were white job seekers, and there was a real commitment to maintaining color lines that were familiar in other places. So there was open and tacit support by local and federal officials for systems of segregation, as Robert has just talked about, and Black women often bore the brunt of this. So the women interviewed for the Hanford History Project made it really clear that even some of the menial positions they found themselves forced to take or watching family members take were preferable to what was available in the South. And that tells us a lot about the conditions they were facing before migration. So these women spoke really powerfully to ways they sought to better their conditions, as Virginia Crippen did, who we just saw a picture of, and I'll talk about her more in just a second. So it feels really crucial to note here how much this tells us about the dismal conditions that African Americans were facing as a result of racism and Jim Crow segregation before they migrated. And a lot of them found their optimism tempered by finding some of these systems recreated when they got to Washington. But even with those limitations and with de facto segregation, the Tri-Cities left open some opportunities that just were not available. So I would say, better doesn't mean equal, and it's really important that we talk about how we can't afford to stop at better. That's also part of this conversation. But it is important to note that these women did find an escape from really brutal sharecropping poverty cycle systems by coming to the Tri-Cities. Black women faced really dire prospects of being stuck in that cycle of marriage, poverty, raising children with severely limited resources, and physically demanding agricultural labor if they didn't leave. And some had risked really early marriage in the hopes of escaping, only to find themselves trapped in another really vicious system of domestic abuse and abandonment and threats of domestic violence, which of course are coupled with larger systems of violence that we're pretty familiar with talking about, including lynching and rape. Only Velma Ray of the women who were interviewed talked overtly about sexual violence and the fear of sexual violence that she faced in coming to the Tri-Cities. And it was while she was living in one of those segregated barracks. But surely others felt this too and braved the risks, even if they didn't talk about it in their interviews. Women who already had children also had to face some really monumental decisions. This is Rose Allen, and she spoke very poignantly about her situation, admitting, "I married much too young." She'd been born in rural Arkansas, and she was already the mother to several children and had already been abandoned by their father when she had the opportunity to come to Pasco. She had a cousin who owned a diner who sent for her, and she jumped at this chance, in her own words, even though she knew she was going to face sandstorms and tumbleweeds when she arrived in the Tri-Cities. In coming to the Tri-Cities, she was forced to leave her children behind with their grandmother, which in and of itself was an incredibly difficult decision. But eventually she met her second husband while she was working at that diner and married him several years later and was able to send for her children. And by the time all of that had happened and she was reunited with her children, she was still only 30 years old, which helps us keep some perspective on how much life is being lived in a short time. Emma Peeples was born in Kildare, Texas in 1940 and came to the Tri-Cities at the age of 16 to join a relative. And she recalled that she didn't know why he asked her to come, but in her words, it was a blessing, not a good move, but a blessing to come to the Tri-Cities. So those who were able to leave really found themselves going to where the jobs were and very often having to leave families behind. And then there are women who are left in the interim to try and hold families together We see this really vividly in Trevor Noah's memories of South Africa as well, that then it falls to women to rebuild separated families and to engineer a sense of normalcy in the midst of these really challenging living conditions. But there's a slow and steady drive toward better opportunities that becomes clearly visible in these stories. Rhonda Ramble's parents had followed word of mouth information and come to the Tri-Cities in the early 1950s. Her grandfather had been a sharecropper, and her father had been a brakeman for the Great Northern Railroad. And he was encouraged by the promise of better educational opportunities for his children. So he moved the entire family to East Pasco. And Rambo noted that this area still had kind of a bad reputation when they arrived, and her father fell ill eventually, so her mother had to go to work working night shifts to try and keep their family afloat. Things were really challenging. But her family made these sacrifices willingly because it was better than staying in Texas, where, in her words, if you didn't get out, you were going to be a farmer, and she wanted more opportunities than that. So not all of the women who came to the Tri-Cities came having this established network of family already in place. I want to spend a little bit of time on Virginia Crippen. She was one of these really intrepid women who came alone. And she explained this very clearly in her interview. She said, "I heard there was work here and there wasn't no place for Blacks to eat, so I come to better my condition." And her recollections really powerfully reveal the situation that was confronting African-American migrants when they got to the Tri-Cities. They were relegated to living in really substandard housing, often cardboard shacks, tents, or chicken houses. And really notably, Pasco wasn't unique in this. This was a similar scenario that played out throughout the West and the Southwest, where, as Robert has just talked about, Black Americans found they could secure good jobs, but they couldn't always secure good housing or even good amenities. They're restricted to the outskirts of towns, to ghettos, to parts of town that don't have running water or sewer services or garbage pickup. And in all of these places, it's Black women who have to really disproportionately deal with then trying to find ways to build homes that are nurturing for children. Initially, there weren't stores or restaurants willing to serve Black customers, and this led to repeated battles over inclusion. But it did create some opportunities for women like Crippen to create their own opportunities and build thriving businesses. And so I think we should wonder if Trevor Noah would recognize what he refers to as the hood in some of these places, this characteristic mix of oppression and opportunity that we see in East Pasco. So Virginia Crippen opened her restaurant in 1948, and she noted that it was really called the Montana, but when people were asked about its name, they just called it the Chicken Shack. Let's go to Virginia's. And over time, it just comes to be known as Virginia's Chicken Shack or Virgie's Chicken Shack. And so she was very acutely aware, even before her arrival, that African Americans couldn't eat no place, in her words, in town. And so she made it her policy to not refuse anybody. She has recollections of serving, in her words, Spanish customers, which is an important nod to the at least 150 Mexican and Mexican American workers who were hired at Hanford during this time. And there are some points in her recollections where she talks about all these customers sitting down and eating together. And we see these little windows of opportunity and community when racism wasn't intervening on those systems. So her experience in Pasco really captures this tenuous economic and social situation that Black residents were being forced to navigate, where white businesses wouldn't serve them, but banks wouldn't loan them money for starting their own businesses. And this is a great quote from her where she talked a little bit in depth about this. She said that it was out of the question to enter white-owned restaurants. And other residents recalled being refused service well into the 1960s. That was still pretty common. But Crippen noted that things did get better. Eventually, you could go into grocery stores and dress shops and you could spend your money, and they treat you nice because you were spending your money. But you better not go to the bank and ask to borrow some money. You could put money into the bank, but you couldn't borrow any money from the bank. And so to deal with these and other challenges, women really relied on their faith. The church in particular became a significant place of community and belonging. And I don't have time to talk about it here, but there is more in the book. And this also became an important staging ground for protesting a lot of these inequalities. So it gives us a lens to view how Black women face the dual challenge of facing discrimination on the one hand and really resenting it and being very aware of it, but also finding opportunities that they were very openly grateful for. So there's a lot of layers to this story, and in the few minutes that I have left, I just want to note really quickly the impact that this had on some of the places people left, including Kildare, Texas. Vanessa Moore recalled being taken back to Texas to visit the place her parents had come from in the 1960s, and recalling that that experience felt really dangerous and that it came with very strict rules, things like get off the sidewalk, don't look people in the eye, speak only to certain people. And she recalled being warned by her parents that, quote, you can't act the way you do in Richland because it would not be accepted. And so she saw why people wanted to leave. So this fear of danger and violence left deep emotional scars. And this is one of the things we are pretty openly trying to have conversations and wrestle with at the present time. So the timely conversation. But the decision to leave in and of itself could be a potentially dangerous act. And the women interviewed were very aware that their parents' decision to leave or their own decision to leave had very much shaped their lives and their children's lives. And that children came of age being really instilled with the knowledge that their parents and grandparents had sacrificed, in some cases, ties to their birthplaces in order to have other options. And this is another common thread that we see with Trevor Noah's writing. Racism is systemic, but it's also deeply personal, and it finds expression in different ways. Overt discriminatory laws. When Vanessa Moore's father sought to move his family from East Pasco into Richland to give his children better educational opportunities, he was really acutely aware that because Pasco was still segregated, only about 30% of Blacks completed high school there, while over 80% of white students managed to attain a diploma. And that was at least partly the result of severe discrepancies in equal facilities, right? Were not available. So Moore's father refused to be defeated by this. He was refused the option of buying a house, so he became a real estate agent and created his own opportunities and eventually did move his family to Richland. And Moore recalled later that when she returned to Pasco to visit friends and family, she would face taunts of, you live in Richland, you think you're white. So like Trevor Noah, she very much experiences being both an insider and an outsider within the community, all for the sake of better conditions. Moore also spoke to some really personal experiences that I just want to honor for a second. She noted once agreeing to attend the senior prom with a white male friend and eventually rejecting his romantic advances, to which he responded, do you know how many friends I lost because of you? She recalled that, well, people looked at her as an individual and not a Black person in her own recollection, that people were also prone to making comments like, here's a comment about Black people, but not you, you're Vanessa. And so being aware of these dual layers of systemic racism and then the very personal impacts of racism is an important part of our conversation. So looking back over his years that he spent in, again, in his words, the hood, Trevor Noah recalled that I chose to live in that world, but I wasn't from that world. If anything, I was an imposter. Day to day, I was in it as much as everyone else. But the difference was that in the back of my mind, I knew I had other options. I could leave. They couldn't. And that knowledge was a powerful thing. So Vanessa Moore and others like her achieved and overcame. She eventually went back to Pasco with her husband. But having that option comes up again and again and again in these stories. So the civil rights movement, as we've already talked about, did finally arrive in Tri-Cities and did finally lead to some major victories for bettering the conditions of all residents. And most of the women who were interviewed for the Hanford History Project expressed being really aware of the implications, but a lot of them, like Rose Allen, actively tried not to be involved. This was a common thread in the women who were interviewed for this project. And so I'd like to bring this back again to a quote from Trevor Noah's mother that appears toward the end of his book that I think kind of gets at the heart of this in a way that would have been relatable to the women who were interviewed for the Hanford History Project. Learn from your past and be better from your past, she would say, but don't cry about your past. Life is full of pain. Let the pain sharpen you, but don't hold on to it. Don't be bitter. The women interviewed for the Hanford History Project displayed a similar determination to focus on the fact that they had options and to reject bitterness and embrace hope. And so I want to close with just one quick footnote of, I think, sort of poetic justice. Many of the women who were interviewed for the Hanford History Project had family ties to a very specific place in Texas, Kildare, Texas, which is in Cass County. And Kildare is one of these places that was pretty characteristic in that it was very determined to oppress Black residents who lived there and very determined to keep them bound in these poverty cycles. And so when the Great Migration happened, there was a Great Migration out of Kildare, Texas, and it was kind of a mass exodus. And as of 2017, a remaining resident noted that Kildare doesn't really exist anymore. So without the support of its Black residents, Kildare kind of sealed its own fate and pretty much vanished. So I think a lot of the women interviewed for this project can probably relate to Velma Ray when she was summing up her experience of coming to Pasco and seeing it for the first time and experiencing living there. She said, I thought I was fed up with Pasco, but it's a funny thing about Pasco. When you come out here, you may want to leave, but when you leave, he wants to come back. And a lot can probably also relate to the words of Rose Allen, who said, I was so glad to get out of Arkansas that every challenge I had, I enjoyed it. So I just want to end with this now very familiar refrain that Black lives matter, and so do Black hopes and dreams and aspirations. The women interviewed for this project spoke profoundly to the power in having that hope. And this speaks really profoundly to how much is still at stake and why we need to talk about how important of a premise that is. So I will now turn it over to Tracy Hanshu to lead us through our Q&A.
Thank you so much to the panelists. I really appreciate you helping us connect our regional and local history to the global, because it all matters, as Dr. Arata just said. Before we open up to questions, I have placed in the chat the link for students to verify their attendance and participation tonight with the instructions on how to do that. So please make sure that you access that through chat. Our first question tonight is, my grandmother, a white woman, worked at Hanford in the kitchen when Hanford was being built. She was open about the segregation she saw there and when she became a teacher nearby. However, I have found the generations below her wanted to gloss over these issues. Why do you think that is?
I'll go ahead and try answering that. And then Laura, Robert, if you want to add anything, feel free. I think some of that is it's always challenging to deal with the difficult parts of our past, right? we like celebratory history as a nation. We don't like to deal with the painful parts of our history. And I think that's a big part of it. And I also think some of it is people not knowing enough about their history. A lot of people, when I've talked to people about some of these things, had no idea some of these things had happened, really don't know the history of their community. So I think my answer to that would be both it's sort of a lack of knowledge and understanding of history, and also a desire to sort of not want to have to wrestle with the painful parts of our past.
I mean, part of it is not being coy, right? African Americans were purposely moved out of the way, right? Literally on the other side of the tracks, kept out of important positions, restricted in employment for decades, and so there's a concerted effort there somewhere. Now, of course, not everybody in the Tri-Cities wanted that, but that was you know, a lot of African Americans weren't visible because they were kept from being visible. At Hanford, to build on Bob's point, there is especially a desire to tell pretty triumphal narratives about Hanford's role in World War II, and to really keep the focus on a certain type of history in the Tri-Cities, and that's this history of science and technology. And that comes at the expense of learning from some of these trickier parts of our cultural and social and racial history that do permeate and really impact the physical development of the Tri-Cities, social development. And I just want to share one anecdote before I turn it over. That when I first started doing interpretation out at Hanford, there was language in docent script for tours that African Americans had requested segregated facilities because they were uncomfortable with the segregation, or with open facilities, and that had come from someone who was so clearly uncomfortable with talking or with thinking about this history that they had chose instead to invent and kind of revise that history to account for why there would be segregation in the Pacific Northwest. And I don't think there was any ill will behind that, but it spoke to me to the lack of understanding of this history and the lack of due diligence that we're really trying to correct with this effort, and building on the earlier efforts of Access and other groups who have done the hard work of collecting and telling these stories to us.
I think it's important to note too, just on a broader, like the broadest of scales, it can be hard to know where to start having those conversations. And especially if you've not grown up in an environment where you were taught to ask those questions or told that it was okay to ask those questions. And, you know, as students of just the world around us, it requires getting really uncomfortable to say, okay, well, where do I need to open having a conversation about why some people are more visible than others? So, you know, it's props to grandma for being open and talking about that, right? That's such an important first step.
Thank you. Our next question kind of speaks to the systemic issue with racism. So the question is, what do we know about the political leaders in the Tri-Cities who were advocating for these racist policies? And do you know anything of their motivation?
So I think it's important to understand that this sort of system of segregation that was really put in place during World War II involved government at all levels. So it was the federal government, because it was the Army Corps of Engineers that constructed the Hanford site, and segregation was official federal policy at the time. The state government was involved. The governor at the time, Arthur Langley, essentially made an agreement with local leaders that after the war, all African Americans would be sent back to the South. And local leaders, the mayors at the time, city councils, were very much involved in creating segregated policies, encouraging segregation. Police departments, especially in Pasco and Kennewick, were very racist in the execution of their policies. So it was really a system that was instituted at all levels of government, and all levels of government were involved. So local governments were involved, but not just local governments, state and federal as well.
I just want to add that I think going even further back, when you look at the establishment of the very first Oregon Territory in the 1840s, in this very large territory that later becomes Washington and Oregon, Idaho, according to that territorial charter, Blacks were specifically excluded from being inside Oregon Territory for any reason. And so going back, far back, you know, there was an attempt to police Black presence in within this region that becomes the Pacific Northwest. And so this shouldn't come as a surprise to us historically that these sentiments had existed, because this is civil rights, and these issues are not a Southern problem, or not a Southern issue or Southern fight. It's an American fight and problem and issue.
Yeah, I'd like to just one more thing. The very first chapter, sort of introduction of our book, I discuss the murder of a Black man by law enforcement in 1908 in Kennewick. So it was something that was in existence from almost the beginning of the towns here. And that's not unusual. As Robert said, this was not something that was a Southern problem. It was a national problem. And that included the towns that later became the Tri-Cities. Yeah.
Thank you. Somewhat following up with that then, could you explain how and when the Kennewick ban on Black residents ended?
Sure, I'll go, and Bob can probably provide some useful information. So the ban was never an explicit written policy for the most part. It was a largely informal agreement by realtors and residents to not rent and to not sell to African Americans until Kennewick was targeted by CORE, largely the Congress on Racial Equality, but with help from the NAACP, to try to target Kennewick to get a Black renter in there. In addition, Kennewick Public Housing had a stipulation that one had to be a resident of Benton County for 90 days before you could apply for Kennewick Public Housing. And if no one's going to rent to you, and you live in Franklin County in East Pasco, you're not getting into public housing in Kennewick, right? And it had been suspected that was written in order to enforce this kind of de facto ban. But the city of Kennewick passed a fair housing ordinance in, I believe it was 1965, Bob, right? They were one of the first. Bob can correct me if I'm, but it was in the 60s they passed this equal housing ordinance, and eventually the first renter is placed, John Slaughter is placed with the help of CORE in Kennewick, but literally this was done by subterfuge. John Slaughter's wife would go with a white woman, Nyla Browns, to look at a home for rent, and Nyla, the white woman, a white ally, would do all the talking. She would agree they would come to an agreement to rent, and Nyla would turn to Mrs. Slaughter and say, okay, does that agreement suit you, because you'll be living here? And they ended up tricking someone eventually into renting to a black family, and the Slaughter family in their oral history talked about the violence and intimidation that they faced, notes left on their car, broken windows, in terms of desegregating Kennewick. It was a fight to do that.
I would just add to that. Yes, it took a long time. The Washington State Board Against Discrimination came to the area several times to investigate segregation, racial discrimination, violence against African Americans, especially in Kennewick, also in Pasco. So it was something that took years and years. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question is about the legacy or the longevity of segregation. So how does the existence of segregation historically in the Tri-Cities continue to impact the community?
That's a great question. And I think that's a question you could ask not just about the Tri-Cities, but about the United States, right? And most communities in the United States. And so the answer is that it has a long impact in housing. It has an impact in employment. And you see that in the history of the Tri-Cities, essentially as sort of different non-groups moved to the area at different times in the history of the Tri-Cities. They all face this sort of similar segregated housing, discrimination in employment, discrimination by police, so forth. And unfortunately, the legacy of that is still with us in many ways, and not just the legacy, but the active discrimination and segregation is still with us in some ways as well. So it remains with us today, unfortunately, and has a long reach.
I think you can also see it in just how the Tri-Cities themselves have grown and who lives where in the Tri-Cities. You look at a lot of new suburban developments in the Tri-Cities, they're largely white, and who's moving in there, recent migrants, largely Latino and Hispanic, and we talk about this in our last chapter, have really moved into a lot of these older areas of the Tri-City, especially East Pasco, but also kind of East Kennewick, where I live. And you look at, our poverty rates, poverty lines in the Tri-Cities, you match that up with the racial demographics of the Tri-Cities, and you see a striking picture where, almost 3/4 of kids in Pasco School District are on free and reduced lunch, whereas Richland, which has always maintained its close connection to Hanford, has maintained this largely kind of whiter character of the Tri-Cities. 25% of Richland students are on free lunch, and that's because Richland's largely 75% white, and so you see that you see these long-term effects and inequalities that persist today, just with because of changing migrations and changing racial and ethnic dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be the let's put this in like enormous scale person for this discussion, but we're seeing it now too in talks about reparations and what those might look like. And again, I think Trevor Noah has worded that so wisely. How do you get everybody back up to zero? Because we love to think that everyone's on an even playing field and you just have to go out and create your own opportunities, right? Like that is so embedded in just how we think about the world around us in general, growing up in the United States. And not everybody's starting from the same playing field. So that's the longer, really important legacy, as Bob says. It's not just a Tri-Cities thing.
Thank you. Thank you all for responding to that question. We have one question about a sign about not entering Kennewick and what the story is there and when did it come down?
I'll take this first if Bob doesn't mind. So in the course of the 2-year-long project to document this history, I really wanted to find a picture of that sign. I really wanted to talk to someone who'd seen the sign and who would maybe, and I've heard kind of that one of the people I interviewed, his mother had been the one to take down the sign. When I asked him about it, he says that I was a kid, I wasn't sure. I don't know what she would have done with it. That's Katie Barton and her son. I can't blanking on his name, but Mr. Barton. But I couldn't find anything concrete. There's no picture that I can find that exists, but that doesn't mean the sign doesn't exist. And even if there was never any physical sign, which I think there was, enough people remember that sign being there, enough people ask about it, and enough people knew that Kennewick was a lily white town, that it was a sundown town, that even if there was no sign, there didn't need to be a sign because it was broadcast as plain as day by the fact that Kennewick police would stop African Americans driving over the bridge past dark and ask them what they were doing in Kennewick. And if they didn't have a reason, they'd ask them to turn around. The fact that Kennewick wouldn't even put blacks in jail. They would call the Pasco Police Department to come and lock them up. That kind of antagonism telegraphed everything that any Black resident needed to know about going to Kennewick and how welcome they were there. So not sure if there was a sign, but there didn't need to be a sign.
Thank you.
Sorry, Keith Barton. I'm very sorry, Keith. I've interviewed a lot of people. I blanked on your name. My apologies.
One other question about, there's one question that's interesting that had a follow-up about artifacts. And so the question was about the use of black and white photos in comparison to the color photos. Is there a racial intention behind that? Meaning that this hasn't been that long ago. So is there a purpose in using black and white photos after we have the technology for color photos to make it a racial issue?
I attempted to answer this in the Q&A sort of directly, the person who answered the question, but I'll go ahead and the answer to that is I'm old enough to remember when there were still some photos being taken in black and white. So the answer to that question really is about cost and availability. For a while, it was just cheaper to use black and white film for photos, and people had a lot of cameras, just black and white film was used even for quite a while after color was available. So you see this period is sort of transition when there's some photos in black and white and some in color. So it's really nothing intentionally about race or anything. It's just about accessibility and cost and things like that.
Thank you. Another question we had is are there key points that each of you would like us to take away from today's presentation?
I guess I will start if I can. I just want us to all be really aware that these are living stories. It's really tempting to look back and, well, that stuff was in the past, that stuff is done. Like, we're talking about it as part of history, and it's very much still with us. I was really honored to just see over in the chat, at least one of our interviewees is present with us. And, you know, that's a huge honor for me to be able to talk about those stories that were so generously shared with us. So the more we can, on just a broader scale, think about how I always try and encourage my students to think about it, right? History is, it's not that it was, it is with us. We're still living it and wrestling with it, and engaging in these conversations is such an important place to start, whether you feel like they're going perfectly or not. Like, we have to try, and we have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And so thank you to everyone who's here listening. Like, it's such an important thing.
I would just say that civil rights, this history is our history. It's the history of this community. It's all of our history. It hasn't been fully told, especially I think in this community. But it's important to learn. And it's also, it's important to learn so we can understand how to build a better, more inclusive world. And it's also, I didn't mention it, but part of the, it was a team of people that addressed these issues that we brought up historically today. And it was a team of men, women, and white and black. And there were national groups working with local allies, and it was a coordinated effort. And there really was a very important role that white allies, that some Hanford scientists and professionals made in helping to, seeing there was a problem, and taking the hard steps to, in a couple of cases, putting their careers and reputations on the line, like the Browns and the Millers, to address that and to work with people to address inequality. And that, to me, um, as a white man, is very inspirational, because it shows me that there's room for all of us to make a big difference, and to kind of put our action where our words are.
Yeah, I agree with everything Robert and Laura said so eloquently. I would also just add to that. I hope you take away the importance of understanding the history of where you are from, of the place you live in, the place you grew up in. It's so important, and often it reflects national patterns of national history, right? The stories of our American history. But it's so crucial to understanding who we are now, right? Understanding our past. And so that's another thing I hope people will take away.
Thank you. I appreciate you making those points. One question, kind of circling back to addressing an uncomfortable issue, as you said earlier. We had a question posed. Could each of you speak to how the Tri-Cities community has dealt with or is dealing with these powerful and troubling histories?
I'll go first, I guess. I'll say that for many in the Tri-Cities, they probably aren't dealing with the histories, or like that question earlier, sort of ignoring it, hoping it'll go away. But in addition to that, though, I would say there are groups that are definitely trying to make the Tri-Cities deal with that past and present. Local Black Lives Matter organizations, Tri-Cities Diversity and Equity Inclusion Council. I may have gotten the name not quite right, but close. There are groups like that are putting some of these issues, trying to keep these issues currently in the forefront, right? So that local political leadership does not forget it. So I think, unfortunately, a good chunk of the population either doesn't know it or tries to ignore it. But there are some who are really making effort and doing a really good job of keeping some of these issues in the forefront.
I just would like to point to people to, if they want to know what's happening, and talk to people that are really on the front lines doing that. There are Facebook groups for the Tri-Cities Equity and Council that Bob mentioned. There was a WCU, Bob and I were part of a webinar about race in the community back in September that WCU Tri-Cities has on its YouTube channel. Maybe someone can post that in the comments. That webinar, Bob and I provided short historical context, and the bulk of it was hearing from local activists in the Tri-Cities who are actively doing this work. But there is a lot more to be done. I think when you look at what I see, especially living in Kennewick, I look at the boards, I look at the city infrastructure, I look at who's on the committees and the mayor and such, and I don't see the diversity of Kennewick reflected in our local government and reflected in our police forces. I don't see that in the Tri-Cities. And it's in Kennewick where it's almost halfway have non-white. That's really jarring to me. And I think that's a major, I don't know, like, I can't run for city council, or, like, I can't make that specific change myself, but I definitely hope there are people that want to make that change, and I support that change. But there are people out there doing things, and they're active on social media, and hopefully we'll get that link in there so that you can check out some of those organizations.
And again, I'll be the big scale person because honestly, I'm not like super qualified to talk about current day Tri-Cities. I only lived there for a couple of years. Tracy and I switched places, right? I came to Oklahoma and she went there. But, get involved in these conversations on the larger scales too. I currently live in Oklahoma and in Tulsa, where I'm doing a little bit of consulting work this semester. There's a lot of really important conversations that are happening right now about reparations and acknowledging the past. And those are conversations happening really it's not an American thing, right? All over the world, these conversations are happening right now. So find the place that you're passionate about and start asking questions. See who you need to talk to learn more.
I'm just gonna add one more little thing onto this. In talking about the importance of remembering the past and connecting that to the present, that's really all of our responsibility, right? To do that. So I'm gonna quote someone much more eloquent than myself on this, and that is Amanda Gorman in her poem at the inaugural, "The Hill We Climb," said this: "Being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it." So we all have a role in repairing the past. So I will end with that.
Thank you. Eloquent indeed. That is our time. So on behalf of WSU Tri-Cities, on behalf of the panelists, and on behalf of the Common Reading Program, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Thank you to the panel for being here and taking your time. If you are interested in purchasing the book, Echoes of Exclusion, by Robert Bauman, Robert Franklin, Laura Arata, excuse me, Laura, and Tom Marceau, we have the link in the chat. Oh, thank you for the visual. We have the link in the chat. Again, thank you all for coming. Good night, everyone.